Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Nyx, and first things first, let's go over the builds. So with Nyx, I have two separate builds. The first one's focused on survival, and the second one is for disruption and other general missions. So this first build is pretty standard. So it is using Assimilate Augment for Absorb to allow you to pretty much be invincible up until a certain point, but for most people, this augment essentially just makes you invincible. In Steel Path, you will be completely fine up until about 2 hours, and at that point, you won't really be able to survive anymore. So, again, for most people, this ability just completely makes you invincible. With growing power and base strength, this pushes us to the threshold to full strip with Psychic Bolts, and I replaced her first ability with Pool as her first ability is terrible. The reason why her first ability is terrible is even if you armor strip the enemies and use the augment for the one that let's see, do I have one? Yeah, so even if you use Mind Freak augment, which increases the damage of your mind controlled target, and then get it to like 4,000% by shooting into it, and then you armor strip the enemies and apply viral, it still takes like 5 seconds for your mind controlled enemy to kill a single enemy. It just, her one is unfortunately just not very good, so you should pretty much always subsume over it, other than in niche situations like if you're doing disruption and you just want another body to tank for you, and then you can just mind control something and not bother with trying to keep it stacks up or worry about it actually doing anything like killing enemies. Speaking of subsumes, I subsumed Pool, but this is completely free, and there are flex spots in the build. Obviously, with Pool, none of the other abilities in her kit and a survival really need duration, as Chaos isn't very good in a survival, as it just lowers your KPM too much to bother using. As this ability is basically an AoE radiation proc, so what will happen if you cast it in survivals, especially with high range, you'll just apply radiation procs to enemies that are a room and a half away, and they just won't run to you, and your KPM just plummets. So you can get rid of Pool, and if you do, you can then shuffle these three mods and put whatever you want there. If you need duration, you can slot Prime Continuity. If you want duration and strength, obviously Umbral Intensify and Continuity. And then obviously Exilus could be either Cunning Drift for a little bit of range, Power Drift for more strength. As for the arcanes, whenever you are using Absorb, enemy shooting you does proc Avenger, so you are free to run Avenger on this build, which is very nice. And if you're not doing extended missions, you could even drop Arcane Energize for something like Rise if you're reloading a lot and you're using your primary, Rage if you're precision headshotting with a primary, Acceleration if you just want fire rate on your primary, and then of course Velocity, I think it's called. Yeah, Velocity if you want fire rate for your pistols. As for the second build, it is a disruption focus build, using a damage buff over the fourth ability, as you aren't really going to be using Absorb and a disruption, and honestly, you won't really be using Absorb in any mission type outside of survival because it just limits you too much. You lose all of your mobility, it's just way too slow to be able to make use of in other game modes. So I drop her 4 for a damage buff. I was choosing to use Nourish, and of course Chaos Sphere, because in Disruption and in some other game modes, your KPM doesn't matter. So Chaos goes from a pretty bad ability to use to actually a really, really strong ability. So with Chaos Sphere, you are pretty much invincible, especially when combined with armor stripping enemies, mind controlling something so enemies are also shooting at your mind controlled target, and then obviously Nourish has other benefits like AoE proccing viral for you, giving viral on your weapons, giving you infinite sustain essentially, and then also CCing enemies when they shoot you. Since I was using Nourish, this allowed me to drop elemental mods on my Cedo to slot laser sight to get close to 100% crit chance whenever it procs, and hunter munitions to also do dot damage with my Cedo. I was using primary frostbite because I tested it over dexterity and merciless, and it was slightly better with this particular loadout. As for my secondary, I was using a corrosive epitaph. Even though I was armor stripping enemies, None of the other elements would do anything. Blast wouldn't really do any. Well, it already applies Blast. Radiation is technically already applied from Chaos, and then obviously you already have Viral from Nourish. So I just slotted Corrosive just for the off chance that they weren't armor stripped, and for the extra element to buff condition overload damage. If your verse is Corpus, you could, instead of running Corrosive, run Magnetic. If you aren't doing a Disruption, or you're looking for a more AoE oriented build for survival, just any AoE weapons such as the Brahma, Tonkor, Bubonico works really good because you're using Avenger, pretty much just the standard AoE weapons. And the secondary, I would highly suggest the Nucor, as again, you're using Avenger, so you can make use of the Nucor's 10.5x critical multiplier. Melee weapon doesn't really matter too much, use whatever you want. However, the 30% parkour velocity that the Praetos gives is a little nice for camping Absorb, as it makes it so your roll dodges go further. As for your focus school, it is very free, none of them really do all too much, so I just stuck with Moderai for Phoenix Talons, and Sling Strength and Power Transfer for the 50% casting speed and 40% ability strength whenever they would be relevant. And then last but not least, of course, it is a Panzer with the synth mods equipped. Now moving on to the rankings, we'll be discussing Nyx in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, her KPM, secondly, her survivability, thirdly, her viability, and finally, how fun she is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path Mott run with no Spectres, no on-call, and of course no Archon shards. I will be showing a significant portion of disruption footage, and I'll explain why later. So firstly, her first topic, KPM. I'll try to keep this pretty short. I know I've been saying this a lot and then I go on like a 5-minute tangent, but I believe I can do so with Nyx. So Nyx's KPM in a survival setting is pretty decent. It's not great, it's pretty average, and the reason for this is because you're using Absorb, which limits your mobility significantly, and you can't really go in and out of Absorb frequently, as it has a very long cast time and it isn't fluid. And yes, you have a pseudo AoE attached here too, but it's not too great, as it's not a true AoE armor strip. It's like, you can use it to kill an Eximus, but you're not going to be like armor stripping the entire room. And you don't really have anything else in your kit that is contributing to your KPM at all. In fact, the rest of your kit is actually negatively impacting your KPM. But then you also get to use Avenger, which allows the use of some very, very strong weapons, such as the Nucor with a crit build and the Bubonico with a crit build. So at the end of the day, I'll give her a fairly average rank for KPM of a B+. Now moving on to her survivability, and I will also keep this very short, and I'll just say the rank now. I will give her survivability and A rank. Now you may be wondering why an A rank for her survivability when I've said that she's pretty much invincible, and the reason for this is because while yes, she's technically invincible, it's a false invincibility, as all you're doing is converting energy into health. So eventually the enemies will just kill you through your energy pool and through your health. And I think to get an S, you either have to be pretty much invincible permanently, or you have to have such high KPM that nothing can even touch you. So that's why I'll only give her an A. And then, of course, in non-survival, you're not going to be using Absorb either, as it's just way too slow. You're not going to be running through a capture mission sitting in your Absorb. Like, no, you're not going to do that. The same thing with pretty much every other game mode. You're going to be using a different build and pretty much just dropping Absorb altogether. And outside of that, her survivability is still around A tier, because Chaos is a very, very strong CC tool when you can use it and it doesn't affect the mission in a negative manner, of course. Now, moving on to her viability, and she's kind of all over the place. So, for survival, I would never recommend playing Nyx in a survival, because she just isn't good for it. Like, for survival, she just doesn't have any good tools for it. And her 4, which is like your best choice of survivability in a survival, just limits your gameplay so much and just isn't fun. So if I was only rating her viability off of survival, I would just flat out give it an F. But of course there are other game modes, and in other game modes she's pretty average. So in Exterminates, Captures, like all of those other vanilla missions, she's pretty much just an average gun frame with a point and click, super easy to use armor strip. So, you know, it's not bad. And then, but where she excels is she does very good in excavation missions. Not as like a first pick, but you want like a Frost or a Limbo or someone else. But then a Nyx as a secondary is very good as, again, Chaos is a very, very strong CC tool when you get to utilize it. And that also carries over to Disruption, which is where I think that she performs the best at. In my opinion, Nyx is one of the best Disruption frames if you're trying to do Disruption without it being just plain easy mode, such as playing Ashe, Loki, Ivara, Octavia, Revenant, or Rhino, because she has everything that you need for a Disruption without just outright being invincible and just making it a cakewalk. So she has a point and click armor strip that you can use for the demos, and it also helps you kill mobs to get keys. And then she has good survivability in her chaos, keeping enemies off of you while you're killing the demo. I believe Nyx is very, very strong in Disruption, good in excavation, really bad in survival, and then average everywhere else. So I will give her a C rank for her viability. Now, all of that being said, that pretty much carries over to her fun rank as well. In a survival, oh my god, it is so incredibly boring. Again, I would rank it like an F. And normal mission types, it's pretty vanilla, nothing spectacular, so like a C. And then in excavations, like a B, and in a disruption, like an A. So I will also give her fun a C rank. In conclusion, Nyx is a pretty average Warframe, earning herself the rank of C+, only falling behind in the survival game mode and being pretty decent everywhere else.